You know the story already. In fact, you've probably heard it here before. It goes a little something like this. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, John Chapman, better known as Johnny Appleseed, traveled across the fledgling United States of America, barefoot and with a cooking pot on his head, planting apple seeds as he went, thereby spreading the beloved apple basically all over the place. Disney will happily tell you exactly that story. With singing. But that story is, of course, slightly inaccurate. For one thing, Chapman didn't scatter apple seeds willy-nilly all over the landscape. Instead, he very deliberately set up a series of apple nurseries in specific locations, fenced them in, taught the locals how to tend them, and then made return visits every few years to check up on them, perform any maintenance necessary, and collect his share of the proceeds from the sale of apple trees. Nor did he wander all over America doing so. For the most part, his travels were confined to Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, bits of West Virginia, and that very famous American state, Ontario, which we keep in Canada for convenience. To be fair, the Disney-fied version of the Johnny Appleseed story is not as wholly inaccurate as it could have been given their usual standard. Johnny's there, and he is a bit underdressed, which was often noted about him by those he encountered. He is indeed very apple-focused. Accurately enough, he's shown planting the apple seeds in organized rows rather than scattering them around, and there certainly are an awful lot of things one can make with apples. The only major fault with the cartoon short being the overly friendly animals and constant singing. Though, even these had some basis in actual fact. However, as reasonable as it is, the Disney short film does gloss over one important facet of John Chapman, which was even more important to him than apples. See, Chapman was a Christian, which Disney shows by having him carry a Bible around everywhere and sing even more songs in an already song-heavy cartoon about how grateful he is to God. So, fair enough, I suppose. However, what Disney doesn't discuss, probably because there's just so many songs to get out of the way before the short ends, is what sort of Christian John Chapman was. Remember last episode when we talked about Renaissance man Emanuel Swedenborg and his many contributions to science, as well as his rather unorthodox religious views brought about by visions of a man who told him to cut down on his caloric intake one evening? And remember how, from that point on, Swedenborg went a little doolally and claimed the Last Judgment had already occurred along with the return of Christ, and that it all happened in the spirit realm as opposed to the physical world, which meant that nobody except Swedenborg knew about it because only he was given access to the spirit world in order to observe it? Well, much to the relief of everyone at the time, I expect, Swedenborg did not then and there decide that the thing to do was found a church all his own and start converting people to his religious views. No, indeed. As far as Swedenborg was concerned, the information he was presenting and the information he had written up in his book all about every verse of the Bible and what it actually meant, called Arcana Celestia, or Secrets of Heaven, wasn't the sort of theology one based religions on. In fact, Swedenborg insisted that the book wasn't theology at all. It wasn't a study of religion or someone's opinions about religion. No, sir. The books were based on his actual experience of religion as revealed to him directly from the source. It was more like what religion was meant to be, how it was all meant to work properly without the obfuscation of church theology as it had developed since the time of Christ, which took it out of the realms of both theology and philosophy, and so was to be taken much more seriously than either of those disciplines. The whole point of the books Swedenborg wrote was to help mankind understand its place in God's plan and how to live a better life according to God's intent. And hopefully you'll remember that a central piece of Swedenborg's theology was the idea of correspondences, the relationship between two different levels of existence, an idea very similar to Hermes Trismegistus's as above, so below. For example, light corresponds to wisdom because wisdom enlightens the mind, just like light enlightens the eye. Warmth corresponds to love because love warms the mind like heat does the body, that sort of thing. Well, naturally, this is what the Arcana Celestia goes into, finding and explaining all the correspondences of the spirituality of God and man. As one, so the other. You just had to be able to think in correspondences to see how the Bible was really a roadmap for the transformation of man from a materialistic to a spiritual being. But as we said, Swedenborg just wrote books. He didn't run right out and start a new religion or anything. No, that distinction would have to wait until a decade or so after his death and the founding of the new church in 1787, which practiced a form of Christianity known as Swedenborgianism, which is also the version of Christianity John Chapman was intent on spreading across a growing America and bits of Canada, even more than he was interested in planting apple trees. This is GM Word of the Week, and I'm Fiddleback. One of the key tenets of Swedenborgianism, and boy isn't that a mouthful to say, one of the key tenets is that salvation doesn't come by faith alone. It wasn't enough just to believe in God and Jesus and all that. You had to prove your faith by good works, by charity, which came as a great and somewhat unwelcome surprise to everyone who had been through the Reformation. After all, the whole point of the Reformation had been that all the window dressing of religious ceremony and strict observance of holy days and so forth wasn't essential. The only thing God wanted, in order to be considered a real bona fide Christian, was that you believe in Him. When Swedenborg came along and said, basically, faith is all well and good, but where's your proof? Well, that threw a very large wrench into everyone's understanding of how Christianity and religion in general worked. So naturally, several people and organizations took exception to the idea. Swedenborg's writings were held up for examination in Sweden in 1768 to see if they might not actually be heresy instead of just the ravings of a lunatic. Much to everyone's surprise, the conclusion was that his writings were clearly mistaken and shouldn't be taught. Notice it doesn't say anything about whether they were heretical or not, just that Swedenborg made an oopsie somewhere, and it would probably be best if folks didn't go around teaching other folks what he'd said. We're not saying he was nuts or anything, not at all, just that some of it isn't quite right. Just as if he'd used the right mathematical formulas, but couldn't do the adding up properly. Anyway, by 1787, 15 years after Swedenborg died, the first church was formed in England as the New Church, which is granted much easier to say than Swedenborgianismists, but doesn't really tell you much, which was fine with the New Church. As far as they were concerned, there were already too many so-called Christian denominations which were named after the people and organizations that founded them. The New Church was just fine, thank you very much, and clearly not caught up in the personalities and politics of every other religion, which makes for good advertising. By 1789, there were new churches popping up all over England, and it soon became time to send missionaries to America in the hopes of establishing the church there. Our friend John Chapman, Johnny Appleseed, was one of them. Chapman would travel the country spreading the word of Swedenborgianism along with his apples, trading storytelling and preaching for a temporary place to stay for a night and leaving an impression on the locals. Many of whom thought he seemed a bit touched, but they were willing to admit the possibility that it was the touch of genius. And they may have had a point. Not only was he able to convert some of the settlers he met, but he also managed to convert more than a few of the local Native Americans, even though most of the tribes thought he was some sort of nut. Touched by the Great Spirit, they said. Even the hostile tribes gave him a wide berth and left him alone during his travels. Chapman was noted for his kindness to animals and for planting another crop besides apples everywhere he went. Thinking it was of great medicinal value, Appleseed planted dog fennel practically everywhere he planted apples, which is a shame considering it turned out to be nothing so much as a noxious weed of little value. All in all, it's probably for the best that he is most remembered for his apples. Johnny Dog Fennel Seed just doesn't have the same ring to it. But John Chapman was but one person whose life was influenced by Emanuel Swedenborg's writings. Others counted among the faithful to a greater or lesser degree include William Blake, Jorge Luis Borges, Arthur Conan Doyle, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Carl Jung, Immanuel Kant, Helen Keller, and Joseph Smith. Even so, by all accounts, new church membership has always been small. In 2000, there were only about 10,000 practitioners worldwide. Swedenborgianism has a number of differences from your basic brand of Christianity, most notable among them being the idea that the material world and the spirit world are connected, and that, thanks to correspondences, one could be in contact and communicate with the spirit world. After all, that's how Emanuel Swedenborg had acquired the basics of his teachings, and how he knew so much about what religion was really supposed to be all about. In his defense, though, what was about to happen was not his fault. See, in the late 1700s and early 1800s, people were still trying to work out all the same stuff that Swedenborg himself had originally been trying to figure out that we talked about in the last episode. All that stuff about the material nature of the soul, and how thought, imagination, and emotion were somehow generated by an organic brain going about its organic functions in the mind-body problem was still very much up in the air then, just as it is today. And increasingly, the more the new fields of science couldn't explain what was going on, the more people turned towards alternate explanations that perhaps to you and I don't make sense, but did to them at the time. Swedenborg's writings looked like they could fill in the gaps, and so did something called mesmerism. Mesmerism, as originally explained by German physician Franz Anton Mesmer, was all about the natural energy transference that he said was going on all the time between all animate and inanimate objects, which, at the time, he'd called animal magnetism. George Lucas had a different name for it. These days, we think of animal magnetism as a powerful quality of attraction between two people, another way of saying sex appeal. When Mesmer was writing about it, though, he meant it as an invisible, fluid-like force that he could manipulate in a variety of ways. In one case, he believed that by manipulating with magnets the energy of his patient, he was able to temporarily cure her hysteria by changing the flow of this energy about her body. He wasn't entirely convinced of the magnet's usefulness in the treatment, though, and instead put the effectiveness down to his own personal animal magnetism, which he said had built up over the course of the treatment. In 1775, Mesmer was asked to provide an opinion on how he thought the exorcisms of noted exorcist Johann Joseph Gassner worked. Allowing that Gassner really did believe in the power of his religion to expel demons, Mesmer suggested that what was happening had much more to do with Gassner's powerful animal magnetism working upon the flow of energy in the patient than it did on actual religious power. This made so much more sense to the general public than Gassner's religious beliefs being the source that Gassner was soon out of business. Of course, just because the general public finds you credible doesn't mean anyone who actually knows anything does. In 1784, a royal commission appointed by no less than King Louis XVI of France, and consisting of such luminaries and thinkers of the day as influential chemist Antoine Lavoisier, Dr. Guillotine, who invented a device for making people shorter, astronomer-mathematician Jean Bailly, who would be made shorter by Guillotine's device in just a few years during the French Revolution, and some upstart ambassador from the recently independent United States of America named Benjamin Franklin, all examined Mesmer's methods and performed a series of experiments. Curiously, though, the goal was not to prove whether Mesmer's methods worked, but rather to determine if he had indeed, as he claimed, discovered a new physical fluid in the form of the energy that he said every living thing possessed. The commission decided there wasn't any proof for such energy, and that any supposed benefits of the treatment were produced more by the patient's awareness that mesmerism was being used on them, and that the effects were largely down to the patient's imagination. Which, if you know your popular medical terms, was the first reported testing and observation of what would later be called the placebo effect. So the commission having decided that there wasn't any new physical fluid involved, The growing following mesmerism was developing dropped the idea altogether. There definitely wasn't any special fluid being manipulated. Oh, but there was still animal magnetism, and mesmerism did definitely still manipulate the body's energy because the Commission hadn't said the cures didn't work. They did, just not the way that Mesmer had explained. It wasn't long before the practice of mesmerism took on a mystical quality. Since no one could quite explain how it worked, explanations tended to the supernatural. Energy flows in the body were blocked, causing various illnesses and upsets, and it was the job of the mesmerist to open up the channels through which the energy flowed and restore the patient to health. To do this, it was necessary for the practicing mesmerist to bring the patient to a crisis point, during which time the extremis of the crisis would shock the body in convulsion in order to remove obstructions in the humoral system that were causing sickness. That's right, they were adjusting the patient's humors. For more on humors, see our very early episode about humorism. It was noted by observers that during this so-called crisis, patients might seem to be themselves, but were really unaccountable for their own behavior, and that to them, the world appeared to be translucent and luminous. In other words, they entered into an altered state of consciousness, one which was particularly open to the manipulations of the mesmerist, just as the earlier study had said. But according to some observers, subjects in this state were also said to be able to see through the body and could identify the cause of illnesses not only in others, but in themselves as well. And to some folks, particularly Catholic monk Abbe Faria, who was a disciple of Mesmer and his work, this sounded a lot like what was called Oriental hypnosis at the time. Via what was essentially the power of suggestion, Faria was able to induce the trance-like state necessary for mesmerism to do its supposed work, showing that no flow of energy was entirely necessary to the process. Adding to the growing mysticism around animal magnetism and mesmerism was the formation of societies devoted to the study of the phenomena, the first of which were the Societies of Harmony in France. Members of the society would pay to join and then be taught the techniques of mesmerism, which meant that anyone learning mesmerism outside of the society was effectively depriving the society of income, and so mesmerism soon became a secretive practice that could only be learned in one of the official societies, which, again, because they charged for membership in the society, was touted as being easy and simple to learn. Just pay your entry fee, and all the secrets shall be yours. And so, many people did. Mesmerism continued to grow in popularity throughout the late 1700s, even in the face of open ridicule in the press. When it finally made its way out of France and into England in 1787, proposals had already been made for the formation of hygiene societies by which socially mobile ladies could join up, meet together, and enjoy treatments. Treatments that were increasingly divorced from the idea of legitimate medical practice and instead tended toward the realms of the mystical, spiritual healing. Soon, these same sorts of societies were making their way to America and putting on demonstrations for an interested populace. Demonstrations which would show off not only the supposed spiritual healing, but such additional supernatural phenomena as telepathy, clairvoyance, automatic writing, and more. The American public of the mid-1800s ate it up and demanded more. And so, it was these two ideas, Swedenborgianism with its focus on the connection between the spiritual and physical realms, and mesmerism, which claimed the ability to heal by both hypnotism and supernatural means, that laid the foundation on which 19th century spiritualism was built. And it all begins, more or less, in 1848 with a pair of toe crackers known as the Fox sisters, Margareta, Catherine, and their older sister, Leah. At the time, Leah was living alone with her daughter, her husband having deserted her. She was 34. Maggie and Kate, as they were called, were much younger, 14 and 11 respectively, and lived with their parents some distance away in Hydesville, New York. In March of 1848, Both younger sisters heard strange thumping noises in the night, and their mother, totally unaware of what it would start, believed the noises to be made by a ghost, and said so, which will turn out to have been a bad idea. On the night of March 31st, Maggie and Katie discovered that if they clapped their hands, the raps answered back. Neighbors were summoned to witness this astonishing phenomenon. By rapping for yes, no, and letters of the alphabet, the spirit claimed to be a murdered peddler named Charles Rosna, whose throat had been slashed by John Bell, a former occupant of the house, who had buried the remains beneath the cellar floorboards. Digging in the cellar yielded some human teeth, hair, and a few bones. And suddenly, there it all is, all the pieces needed to start another new religion. On ground made fertile by Swedenborg and Mesmer, the Fox sisters came along and planted the final seed. By manipulating unseen energy like Mesmerism said you could, and passing into and communicating with the spirit realm like Swedenborgianism said you could communicate with the dead like the Fox sisters said they did. As sensationalized as the papers made the Fox sisters' story, people still bid on it hook, line, and sinker. Leah took charge of the sisters and got them on tour giving demonstrations of the spirit rappings, as they were called, wherever they went. They held seances in the parlors of the well-to-do in and around Rochester, New York, contacting other spirits of the dead and communicating with them. Then older sister Leah, supposedly advised by the spirits themselves, rented a public hall and had the girls put on a show for an insatiably curious public. Soon the girls were on tour in other cities, and each performance grew more elaborate. Objects moved, tables rose, and even Benjamin Franklin, who you will remember took a poke at mesmerism 100 years before, put in an appearance in spirit form. With money coming in hand over fist, it wasn't long before others began to discover that they too were mediums for the spirit world. Mediums and seances with all their attendant supernatural phenomena on display became all the rage in private homes and on the stage, and many popular public figures of the time were involved in the new and growing religion of spiritualism. The 1888 confession by the younger Fox sisters that it had all been a hoax that started out as a prank on their mother and been taken out of their control by their older sister Leah did nothing to slow it down. As interest in spiritualism grew and more practitioners began cropping up, it became a full-fledged movement and soon thereafter a recognized religion. Converts to spiritualism came from all walks of life, many of them coming to the religion due to the loss of loved ones in their life. With the Civil War just around the corner in America, there were soon more than enough grieving spouses, sons, daughters, brothers, and sisters to fill an auditorium, all hoping for a chance to speak with their missing loved ones. Abe and Mary Todd Lincoln held seances at the White House to contact their dead son. And reformers, too, found that spiritualism often worked in their favor. You'd be surprised how many dead folks were all in favor of abolition, women's rights, various political and social utopias, and whatever other causes were popular and supported by the person making contact with the spirit realm. Not that there's anything wrong with these causes necessarily, just that it was disingenuous to promote them in this manner. When World War I came along, even more folks who'd lost family members looked to spiritualism to reconnect them with their loved ones and signed on for the whole spiritualism package. And along with spiritualism came a renewed interest in other old, disproven, and discarded ideas. Astrology and alchemy had a resurgence, as did various forms of mentalism like telepathy and mind reading. Even a belief in magic as a genuine force in the world cropped up again. But where would it all lead? Thanks for listening to GM Word of the Week. Your generous support is vital to keeping the show going. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider becoming a supporting member of the show at buymeacoffee.com/fiddleback and joining the many worthy people there. Without their support and yours, the show just wouldn't exist. Membership starts as low as $5 a month and includes early episode releases and transcripts of the show. Head over to buymeacoffee.com/fiddleback for more. This has been a Fiddleback production and is researched, written, and produced by Brian Casey. Music comes from Blue Dot Sessions. Head over to sessions.blue for more. This property of the human body, which renders it susceptible of the influence of heavenly bodies and of the reciprocal action of those which environ it, manifests its analogy with the magnet, and this has decided me to adopt the term of animal magnetism.